Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that wonderful introduction, Guy. I so admire your work and the work of your colleagues there. So delighted to be presenting, and would have been happy to make the trip up there, of course. So what? Oh, sorry. This. There we go. Um, so I'm going to be telling you about the intervention that we've been developing over the last 25 years or so called Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-up, or ABC. And this is a 10-session intervention that is implemented in parents' homes. And we think that implementing it in the homes is an important part of this because parents get the experience of practicing the behaviors that we work on over the 10 sessions. And you'll hear about how that works as I go on. This intervention is designed to enhance children's behavioral and biological functioning among children who've experienced early adversity. The three things that we target are nurturing the distressed child, following the child's lead, and avoiding frightening behaviors. And we expect these then to have effects on children's behavioral regulation and biological regulation. First, starting with the importance of nurturing the distressed child. Nurturance is especially important for children who have experienced early adversity. What we find is without nurturing caregivers, children who have experienced adversity are at increased risk for disorganized attachment, which I'll be talking about later, but is the most problematic type of attachment to develop. But two things can get in the way of parents providing nurturance. One is children may push their parent away, and the other is that nurturance just doesn't come naturally to some caregivers. And so I want to first just give you a sense of what I mean by nurturance. If I were to show you a video, I'd show you a video of a mom where a child is distressed and the mom would pick up the child and be soothing, unambiguously soothing. So picking up, patting the back, saying, "Oh, are you okay, honey?" All of these giving the child the message that the parent is available emotionally when he or she is distressed. Now, what it isn't, I want you to picture here a child who gets his finger stuck in a door. And the mom has been telling him not to play with the door because he'd get his finger stuck. But when he gets it stuck, he's crying and she says, "Exactly, I told you." And then, "Oh, that's okay. Let me see. It's okay. It's not broken." So you hear in this a number of ways in which this mom is not being nurturing. First, "Exactly, I told you," which is fussing at him. The "you're okay, you're not hurt." It's not up to us to determine whether the child is hurt or not. It's up to the child. And third, "it's not broken," which is essentially making fun of the child. She knew it wasn't broken. He knew it wasn't broken. There are other ways as well that any of us might engage in. One is, "You're a big boy. Big boys don't cry." "Look outside, there's a butterfly," which is distracting the child from the distress. And another, ignoring. All of these give the child the message that he or she should not bring distress to the parent. But what we want is we want the parent to be there when the child is distressed. So how we do this is in two ways: through manualized content. And in the manualized content, we present videos of other parents and of parents themselves who are engaging in nurturing behaviors and sometimes non-nurturing behaviors. And we present evidence supporting the importance of nurturing care. But what we think is the more important part, and we've got some evidence for this, is making comments in the moment. And I want to describe to you one of these comments. A mom has a child that is fussy and crying, and she's holding him, but he can't settle down. And the parent coach says to her, "Good job nurturing him. He's crying and you're holding him. Even though it's hard for him to settle down, that lets him know you're there for him." Now that sounds very comfortable as you watch it. It doesn't sound scripted. But what this comment does is it does the three things that we want to have included in comments. We don't need to have all of these components in every comment, but we want to see at least one of them. So we want a clear description of the parental behavior. And here it's, "He's crying and you're holding him." You may notice there that we have the child's behavior first, followed by the parent's behavior. And that's the way that we want the description, because we want it to be clear that the parent is responding to the child's behavior. Second, link the parent behavior to the intervention target. We're talking about nurturance with the parent, so we want her to see this behavior linked with the more abstract concept that we're talking about. In this case, good job nurturing him. And third, linking the parent behavior to the child outcome. In this case, it's that lets him know you're there for him. What we want parents to see is that this matters. So we talk in terms of things like, that's the kind of thing that's going to let him come to you when he's 6 years old and worried about a friend that doesn't want to be his best friend anymore. Or that's the kind of thing that lets him develop better relationships with other people as he gets older. So these are all evidence-based outcomes, and we want parents to see the importance of the behaviors that they're engaging in. So I'm going to come back to this, and I know this is very small, but I'm just showing you how we code this. We take a 5-minute clip from one session a week, and what you have here is it says we describe the parent's behavior. Child cries while mother is holding him, and the mother is holding him, and then that is coded as nurturance, as a 5. And then we've got the parent-coach response. He's crying and you're holding him. Good job nurturing him. That lets him know you're there for him. And again, that gets coded because that's referring to nurturance. And then over here, how many components are included? There's 3, because it's the description, the target, and the outcome. So we code this 5-minute clip that sometimes has as many as, that could have 20, 25 opportunities for following the lead and nurturance in it. So our second component is following the child's lead. And how we came to this is that I'll describe this to you. We looked at the functioning of the HPA axis. And my bet is that everybody here knows the HPA axis. This refers to the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and it is highly sensitive to the effects of early experience. And cortisol is an end product of this axis. There are 2 orthogonal functions of this axis: the stress reactive function, that is, the body's mounting a stress response. But among babies and young children, we have found it's harder to see the effects of early adversity or early treatment on this, because the child is essentially protected from mounting a response for the most part by the availability of a caregiver. The second function, though, orthogonal, is the diurnal function. And this is helping the organism function as a diurnal, in our case, or nocturnal in the case of a nocturnal creature like some rodents and so forth. It helps us to get up in the morning, go to bed at night. Don't worry about what's here on the y-axis, but what you see here is a high morning value of cortisol. 30 minutes after wake up, it peaks and then comes down very precipitously and is a near 0 level at night. Now, this is unrelated to stress. This really reflects the metabolism of glucose, more energy essentially in the morning, which helps us get up in the morning, and lower metabolism of glucose in the evening, which helps us go to bed at night. And so this is one of those systems that is interfered with by something like traveling across many time zones, or working a night shift versus a day shift, and so forth. So where we try to look at this is as close to wake up as we can and close to bedtime. And what we see among low-risk children is a nice high morning value and a low evening value. When we look at children in foster care, we see a lower morning value and not quite as steep a slope. And then when we look at children that are neglected, living with their neglecting birth parents, we see the flattest slope of all. And so this told us that a basic biological rhythm was being dysregulated by adversity. And so what we wanted to do is how do we help children develop better regulatory capabilities? And it's more obvious now, I think. There's a lot more evidence for this, but at the time, we had to struggle with making sense of this. But what we found is some evidence that when parents follow their children's lead, or when they're better attuned to their children have better self-regulation. And so what we, oops, sorry about the typo. One of the ways in which a parent may follow the child's lead better is by following the child's behavior or vocalization. For example, child was, sorry, let me go back here. If a child, if I had a video, what I would show you is a child who tilted their head back and forth, and the parent doing that in response. And then the child started putting her hands in front of her face, and then the mom started doing that in response. And so it became a very well-tuned interaction in which the child was taking delight, essentially, in the parent following her lead. And as children get older, this becomes more verbal rather than behavioral. So at that point, the parent may be more likely to say something like, "Oh, you're playing hide and seek," or something like that. So then there are characteristic ways for parents not to follow the lead, including intrusive behaviors, such as a parent who might mess with the child, might fiddle with the child's head, try to take something out of the child's hair or whatever, or take control, handing the child a phone, correcting the child, or being teachy, saying what color is that, or bossy, or just ignoring. And all of these quickly become uninteresting for the child and are not smooth regulating interactions, and in fact can be dysregulating. So this is an example of a parent coach. I'll describe it, a parent coach supporting following the lead. And what you have here is the child who reaches out a piece of paper to the parent taking that piece of paper, and the parent coach saying, "That's perfect." Little things like that, even like her reaching for something and you giving it to her. That's going to make her feel important and like she can have an effect on things around her. Now back to the comments having components. Here we have a description of the behavior with, again, that same format of the child's behavior and followed by the parents, like her reaching out and you're giving it to her. Linking it to the intervention target, we didn't see that, but if we had, she would have said something like, "You're following her lead." And third, linking it to the child outcome. That's going to make her feel important and like she can have an effect on things around her. Now, again, we code this. The child hands paper to mother. Mother takes it. That would be following the lead. Like her reaching out and you're giving it to her. This is what the parent coach says. And again, that the target there is the same as following the lead. And that would have two components over here. And then what we get at the end of coding the 5 minutes is we get a number of metrics. And here I'm only presenting 5 opportunities, so it's a small sample. But so every week the parent coach is going to get metrics on how they're doing in terms of making comments, how their percent of on-target comments, their percent of their number and percent of missed opportunities, and how many components per comment. And then it's nuanced beyond that and beyond what you need to know of it. But again, we'll come back to the importance of that this really relates to us being able to do it in a way that we can talk very clearly about what it is that we're doing. We can have the impact, but it also relates to us being able to tell other people what we're doing, this coding system. So the third component, avoiding frightening behaviors, we do not, for the most part, make comments about this in the moment because these are more threatening to parents. And so I'm not going to go into detail on that, but we do address this through intervention content once we've gotten to know the parent better than at the first couple of sessions. So in terms of outcomes, what we have found, what I'm going to take you through is some of the outcomes on parental functioning and then mostly effects on child outcomes. What we find is that parents who received ABC are more sensitive at post-intervention than a control intervention. And what we've done is we've assigned parents to either the ABC intervention or what we call DEF, or Developmental Education for Families. And what Developmental Education for Families is it's a 10-session intervention that we have borrowed from a cognitive and motor development intervention. We took out any of the sensitivity aspects, but we kept the cognitive and motor development. So it looks very similar, and parents are not aware of whether they're getting the experimental or the control intervention. Both are 10 sessions, both are in the homes, both involve parents and children. And what we find in terms of sensitivity is medium to large effects. We've now done 4 randomized clinical trials, and then we've done a lot of dissemination research in which we've just done pre to post. And I think one of the things that's surprising and exciting is that these gains are sustained 3 years later. We see just as big effects at 3 years post as we do immediately after. Second, intervention effects on parental brain activity. And this was dissertation work by Kristen Bernard. But what we modeled this on is work by Rodrigo, in which Rodrigo had looked at brain activity of neglecting mothers. And what Rodrigo had found is that neglecting mothers could tell you which of these babies was crying, neutral, or laughing. But when you looked at their brain activity as assessed through ERPs, there was no differentiation of these faces. And so what we wanted to see is, one, can we replicate that finding? And two, can we change this in ABC versus DEF parents? So we compared the 3 groups, low risk comparison, DEF, and then ABC. And what we're looking at here, we're looking at both the N170 and the LPP, but I'm going to focus on the N170. Both have similar effects. The N170 is a very immediate. That's 170 milliseconds post stimulus, so post after they've seen the face. This is pre-conscious, so it's an automatic response. And what you see among the low risk group is what you would expect, and that is a separation of these curves. So that in terms of neural activity, they are distinguishing the crying and laughing from the neutral. But what you see among our control group, the DEF, is a failure to differentiate in terms of neural activity. Again, these curves are overlapping. And with the ABC, what you see is a differentiation of these curves. Exactly what we would have wanted to see, a differentiation in ABC, but not DEF. Now, when we looked at mothers at 8 years post-intervention, we conducted something called the Secure-Based Script Knowledge Assessment that Theo Waters and colleagues have developed and refined. And parents are asked to make up a story with using these words as props, and they don't have to use all of the words. About half of the stories have illicit attachment themes, at least for lots of mothers, and half of them don't. So the words here, Tommy, hurry, mother, etc. So a mom from here's a good secure base story is Tommy fell on his bike. He had been in a real hurry. He came in to see his mother, and his mother said, "Oh, Tommy, are you okay? You look like that hurt," and go on from there. So the mother being supportive of the child, not fussing at the child, being able to scaffold his experience at the doctor and so forth. Versus a problematic story and this is an example of one, is a child who comes in and the mother says, Tommy hurt himself. The mother didn't know what to do. You know how it is with your child, you don't know what to do. She took him to the doctor, and the doctor said he'll be fine. And she said, Tommy, why were you doing that? You shouldn't have been biking so fast. So that's an example of, she got an attachment theme, but she was not very helpful to Tommy. She didn't scaffold his experience. So what we do is we code this for secure-based script knowledge. And what we find is that our ABC moms are significantly better in this than the DEF moms, and not any different from the low-risk moms. Now, this is 8 years post-intervention, and I want you to keep in mind that the intervention is only 10 sessions long. So it's It's a little is a little surprising, is what I would say, but it probably feeds into why we're seeing a lot of the child outcomes be so uh, sustained so well over time. So back to the child outcomes, what we expected to see is changes in behavior regulation and biological regulation. So first, we assessed attachment in the strain situation. And again, I imagine that you all know the strain situation. This is about a 25-minute laboratory procedure in which the child is separated from the parent twice and reunited. And you're looking primarily at behaviors in the reunion for coding. And so what we see is what we're looking for here is differences in organized attachment, where the child has an organized strategy for interacting with the parent when distressed. And this could be secure, it could be avoidant, or it could be resistant, but it's organized, versus disorganized, where a child shows a breakdown in strategy or a lack of strategy. They do something like this child is screaming but not moving to the mom, or a child that turns around in circles rather than goes to the mom, or a child that hits at the mom rather than being able to use the mom effectively. And what we find, or what has been shown in the literature, is that attachment disorganization is particularly problematic because of its association with externalizing problems. This is a meta-analysis here, and with dissociation or spacing out. This has been found in it's been looked at in fewer investigations, but both of these effects are fairly robust. So what we see is of our children in the ABC intervention, and most of these are an N of about 120. This is an N of 120. These are all Child Protective Services involved children who were referred to us from Child Protective Services. What we see for ABC is that 32% of these children show a disorganized attachment, as contrasted with 57% in the DEF or control group showing a disorganized attachment. Now, what you would expect to see in a low-risk sample is about 15 to 20%. So this number is still higher than you would see in low risk. I'm not confident we could ever get below that with a sample this high risk, below 32%, but probably worth shooting for. Next, looking at intervention effects on diurnal cortisol production, we're looking at this at wake up and bedtime for 3 days. And I want to remind you what we don't want to see. We want to make this slope steeper. These are the kids that we're intervening with here. So we want to make this slope steeper. And it's the red line is for ABC children, and what you see is a significantly higher morning value and a significantly steeper slope across the day for the ABC than the DEF children. Now, this is soon after the intervention. The question is, would you expect to see this several years post-intervention? And we do see this. We see an effect that is as big 3 years post-intervention, higher morning value, steeper slope than seen among the DEF children. Now, looking at children when they are middle school age, so we're now looking at children when they're 8, 9, and 10, and we don't see a direct effect of ABC on diurnal slope, but we see a mediated effect. We see ABC intervention affecting sensitivity, which has an effect on diurnal slope. So we see an indirect effect of ABC on the diurnal slope through parental sensitivity at age 8. So now to think of affecting something like inhibitory control or impulse control, I would argue that when a child is 4 years old or 5 years old, going into preschool or going into kindergarten, the most important thing is that that child be able to sit in his desk and attend to the teacher or do a worksheet or whatever it is, rather than jump up and look out the window. That's more important than knowing numbers and letters. And so how we assess this is we use the DBDOS, or Disruptive Behaviors Diagnostic Observation Schedule, that Lauren Bachschlag and her colleagues developed. And with this, we have children a number of tasks, but one of them is we present them with a beautiful array of toys. And you'll see these toys here, and here are the instructions, but it's this experimenter has demonstrated how cool all these toys are, and how much a ball that will come through a chute, and all sorts of things that do interesting things. And then she says,
now remember, when I'm doing my work, don't touch any of these toys, okay?
And children handle this task very differently. This child is able to work on the very boring coloring book that he's got relative to these toys, look up in a while and say, I'm finished. Other children aren't so good at handling this. Another child who is messing with the toys, the experimenter says, remember, these are only for looking, not for touching. And he says, I'm not touching, while he's pulling at them. And then she takes it away, and he yells at her and then turns the table upside down. So children really vary a lot. And this task is very demanding, but so is preschool, and so is kindergarten. And I think it's got similar demands as some of the that children experience in real life. And what we look at several different types of things, but one of them is how long before children touch the toys. And you can see that the ABC kids take longer to touch the toys than children in the DEF group. They also touch it for a shorter duration than other children. Fewer of the children touch the toys, and so forth. So it's a pretty robust effect. These effects are now in press as well. So the thing that I would mention about these findings is that we're helping parents to be nurturing and follow the lead. We're not doing anything with this intervention in terms of behavior management or anything that seems necessarily to have implications for inhibitory control. But what you can see is that parental sensitivity and nurturance does have an effect on children's impulse control or inhibitory control. Now, this is a more intuitively tied outcome, I think. We looked at attachment security in middle childhood. We don't have most of our data yet coded for our middle childhood, our behavioral data, but we've got some of our self-report, and we've got most of our physiological data available now, and so I'll be telling you about that. But we asked children on the Kerns security scale. This is 15 items, and we asked them, or the Kerns questionnaire asked them things like, some kids find it easy to count on their mom, but other kids find it hard to count on their mom. Which is more like you? And they choose one of those, and then is it really like you, or is it sort of like you? And what we find is that our ABC kids say they can count on their mothers or their primary caregiver more than the children in the control group, in the DEF group. And again, this is 8 years post-intervention. Working with NIM Tottenham, we have looked at child brain activation assessed through fMRI. And this is a subset. We got supplemental funding to look at this, but a subset of our children. And we're going to tell you about two tasks: an attention to threat task, where children are presented neutral and fearful faces. And what we care about is their neural response, their brain activation, when they see the fear face versus the neutral face. But what we ask them to do is just push the button when you see the butterfly. And the reason for that is we just want to make sure that they stay attentive to the task. But what we find first is that we find no difference between ABC and DEF in how attentive they are to the threat. There is that both high risk, including both the ABC and the DEF, show greater activation of the occipital cortices and the fusiform gyrus. So they're both orienting to the threat more than the low risk children. But what you see is that ABC children have greater activation of the right orbitofrontal cortex and the right insular cortex and the ACC than do the DEF. Now, where I want to take that is I want to say that the early adversity, we have not protected children essentially from a scar of early adversity, from living in a challenging world. But what we've done is that we have helped them, or ABC has done, is ABC has helped them have greater regulation over that. So they may experience a threat, but they can then regulate or control their response to that better than children in the control group, which is, I think quite exciting. In a mother-stranger task, here we present happy and neutral faces, and we ask them to indicate when they see the happy faces. But again, what we care about is not the happy neutral. What we care about here is mother-stranger. And we see the ABC kids show greater activation in the posterior cingulate gyrus and the middle temporal gyrus when they see moms versus strangers. And this is consistent with there being greater salience of mother faces. We also, this is Johanna Bick's work with looking at neural activity assessed through EEG. And what is known is that as the cortex develops, there's a reduction in the low frequency band, the theta activity, and there's more activity in high band, the alpha and beta power. And Johanna had been involved in the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, in which they had seen intervention effects in which children who had been moved from orphanage care showed more of the high band activity and less of the low band activity. What I would say is that moving from orphanage care is a much bigger intervention than a 10-session intervention. So it felt a little overambitious to expect this. But what we found is exactly that, is that children in the ABC intervention showed higher beta activity, and that's the high band relative to children in the control intervention. And this is consistent with a more mature brain development, more mature cortical activity. So what we're seeing differences in parents that you've seen: sensitivity, neural activity, attachment script knowledge. In child, I haven't gone through all of these, but attachment, cortisol, we looked at whole genome DNA methylation, language development, emotion expression, executive functioning, and then I think I've mentioned these other ones. And so we've got an effective intervention, and that means that what we need to do then is implement that in the field. But as a field, what we know is that it's really difficult to get an intervention implemented with adequate fidelity. And what happens then is often interventions have much smaller effect sizes than they did when implemented in the lab. So what we thought was that our comments were the key, and that this is, as we trained people could get to know what was in the manual, but often people were not making comments in the moment, whether it was people we were training in-house or as we started to disseminate. And what we had expected is that these were central to the intervention. E.B. Kerns and others looked at this and found that in the moment commenting indeed predicts parenting behavior. The higher frequency of on-target comments and more components both predicted parents following the child's lead and greater decreases in intrusiveness. It also predicted whether parents were going to drop out of treatment or not. So we expected it to be a central part. We were seeing this at the case level and at the anecdotal level, but we saw it in terms of our findings. But the problem is it's really difficult for people. What we're asking is something that's so unlike what people do typically in their clinical work. Instead of, in some ways following the parent's lead, we are being very active. We are making comments at least once a minute. And parent coaches would be concerned about interrupting the interaction, worried about being condescending, and worried about all kinds of things, worried about saying the wrong thing to the parent. And so we we worked at this. And first, we just asked parent coaches to make more comments. This is before we developed that coding system. And of course, it didn't increase in frequency, just asking people to. And then we developed the system that you have seen. And we provided feedback every week with regard to their performance. And I would have sworn that this would work, that if somebody heard, oh, you're only making 2 comments in a 5-minute period, you need to be making 5, that they would up their level. And it just wasn't working. So what we did then is we asked parent coaches to code themselves. And so every week, not only would we code their 5-minute session, they coded a 5-minute clip from their session as well. And this was the voila. This was the key that got parent coaches to make comments. I speculate that what happens then is that parent coaches become great critics of themselves. They go around in the world coding everything, coding people at the grocery store, coding family members, and so forth. But they become critics of themselves. They notice when they don't make comments. But we've got single subject data where we looked at parent coaches before coding and then after coding themselves, and we see this peak, this sort of rapid increase in making comments. I'm going to just show you one example. We have permission to show this mom anywhere. So what this is before this parent coach has said one word from intervention session 1. So this is the very beginning, and she's a very active parent coach, as you'll see.
Get it. Beep, beep. Yeah, so she's making the toy beep and you say beep beep. That's perfect. And she's pushing the button on hers and you push the button on yours. Right? Calling her lead. Yeah, and even stuff like that. We're talking about ourselves. Yeah, and she picks it up like a phone and you pick it up like a phone. All that stuff. So we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, but I already have seen so much of it. So I just, mostly during the sessions, you guys will play together.
So what you can see there is the parent coach very engaged with making comments about what's going on with the parent-child interaction. And people have different styles for it. This is a very active parent coach, but it is powerful, and you often see a cascade of behaviors with the parent starting to follow the lead or nurture once she has seen what the parent coach is talking about. So maximizing the likelihood of success. We want to train parent coaches that are likely to succeed. When we started, we had no degree or licensure requirements, and we still don't. But what we found is that some just couldn't make the comments. So we developed a screening instrument, and we have potential parent coaches seeing videos like the one you just saw, and then they see another one in which the parent coach hasn't made a comment, and they are asked to make a comment themselves. And so what we want to see when we screen people is that they are willing to take this task on of making comments. And so with that, we're able to see, do they get this issue of making comments? Some people just won't. And generally, do they, we can get some sense of being able to differentiate between following the lead and nurturing, even in this screener. We also give a mini version of the adult attachment interview, a very short 5-minute version of the adult attachment interview, not to assess attachment state of mind, but rather just to get at openness and willingness to look at one's own issues, so an evaluating of attachment. So what we've got is an alignment of screening, training, supervision, fidelity monitoring with regard to what we see as the active ingredient, the making comments. And so in our screening, we do that. Our training, we introduce this making comments and coding comments on day 1 of training. And then we supervise when we disseminate this other places. We supervise for a year. We provide an hour of general traditional supervision and then a half an hour of the coding supervision every week. And in order to be certified, you've got to reach criteria, which is making these comments. And we have particular criteria for that. And what we find is we find effects that are as big in the community as we find through randomized clinical trials. We get large effects in terms of sensitivity and intrusiveness in the community, and this is 18 different sites here. And we're continuing to collect data, but this is what we see across sites, and we continue to see across sites. So a model of our intervention effects. I've got the darkness of the arrow reflects the strength of the evidence that we've got in support of this. So what you might notice is we've got real strong evidence that we affect through our intervention following the child's lead, parents following the lead. And we have new evidence from a dissertation of Heather Yarger that we've got evidence that we're changing, avoiding frightening behavior. Nurturing distressed child, we, interestingly, even though that's so central to us, we just don't have a good quick measure of that. And so we have neglected this somewhat, and we're changing that now. We're now getting assessments of this through several measures. We've also got strong evidence that following the lead affects child behavior regulation and biological regulation. I didn't present you some of that, but we've got a number of mediated effects there. And at least we're just starting to look at how frightening behavior mediates behavioral regulation, but we've got evidence of this as well. So we've got a lot of colleagues. They're not all recognized on this slide, but this is the students and colleagues at University of Delaware and other places who have been instrumental in this work. And then I've been supported by NIMH over the years and have gotten donor support from Edna Bennett Pierce. So thank you very much.